Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to another episode here at amazic.com where we talk about all things cloud, Kubernetes, containers, cloud native. And we talk to some of the cool vendors, organizations in the space that are building really innovative solutions to help you operate in the cloud better. And we've got one more for you today, a treat from one of the real innovators in the space, someone that's been around for years and that's got some really cool products that have really kind of like, uh, they set the gold standard in the space that they're in. Really excited to talk about their products. I have with me today Kerim Satirli, who is the Senior Developer Advocate at HashiCorp. Kerim, it's great to have you with us. Thanks for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited to chat with you.
All right, all right. So we're actually talking just on the cusp of, one of your two big events. So you have two big events through the year, and one of them is coming up just around the corner. HashiDays happening on the 13th of July. It'll be
June, actually,
virtual.
even closer.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, got that wrong. Yeah, 13th of June. And this is going to be your Europe-focused event, right? Could you tell us a bit about it?
Yeah, it's super exciting that instead of requiring people to travel, which can be hard, not everyone has the means to that, we're coming to your city. We're organizing HashiDays in London, Paris, Munich at the same time. And if you want to be joining us from home, then you can also enjoy it all virtually. I'm excited about that because the logistics for that are hard. It's almost like you're trying to figure out, how to scale an event to multiple regions, because that's literally what it is. And I think we've got some pretty cool announcements coming up.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's one of the, the side effects of the post-pandemic world, right? It's virtual first, and
Exactly.
it's great that we can get to connect across different places now.
I personally can't wait. I'm going to be in Munich. I've got my colleagues in Paris and London, of course. We've also got folks online. So wherever you are, come say hi. Let's talk about what you found inspiring, what you found interesting, how you like the new features that we're going to be announcing and new things. And let's make it a great event.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so give us a bit of a sneak peek or sort of get us excited about what's coming. You mentioned there's new features. Without really going into the details of what the features are, could you sort of give us a sneak peek of what's coming?
Of course. Let me think the best way to put this is, I don't want to steal the thunder from the teams that are actually building really cool stuff. But for us, security is a strong focus. We want to make sure you have a good experience when you use our tools. We want to make sure you can deploy in a reliable and predictable way. And part of that is having a really strong security story. So that's what we're going to focus on for HashiDays. We'll have workshops around that. We'll have actual sessions, keynote presentations, product demos. There's going to be a lot of stuff that we're announcing. Sorry for being so...
No, yeah, that's cool. Sounds like, yeah, you got something for everyone. You got something for like the CXOs and VPs, and then there's some for even the tech leads, to get their hands dirty. Sounds like there's a bit for everyone.
I think that for us has always been the goal, to make an event that we ourselves would attend. Sometimes, you have events where it's like, it's all product announcements or it's just workshops. And we want to have a little bit of a mix of both. If you just want to be there enjoying some, product announcements and then just enjoy the hallway track, totally fine. But like you said, if you want to get your hands dirty, our education team is organizing 2 workshops per city. And of course, also online, we can learn how to work with Boundary, HTTP Boundary, how you can bring dynamic credentials into Terraform. It's a ton of fun. I've seen 2 of these workshops and done beta tests for it. They are worth it.
All right. Awesome. Sounds really exciting. So for everyone watching us here, if you at all been interested in the past or you're considering any of HashiCorp's products, definitely go and check out HashiDays. Go register for the event. It's virtual, or if you're in one of these cities, go and meet them. It's going to be a really cool event.
Definitely. Virtual Pass is free. So you get access to the videos. You can chat with people, not just us, but also other practitioners. And realistically, for me, that's where a lot of value comes from. You'll be chatting with people that run the same tooling as you, that might have the same questions. They might be further in their journey. They might be earlier. You'll definitely learn something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sounds really cool. So Kerim, as we get started, I wanted to actually just ask a bit about you and just your journey, just leading up to HashiCorp, the things you've done, and what's led you here to where you are today.
What's led me here? So before I joined HashiCorp, I was an organizer for the Amsterdam HashiCorp user group, because for me, it was really simple. I've always been trying to build communities. I started in 1999 in Austria. Back then, as a student, I had just discovered web development, and I was like, you know what? I like this. I have questions, and there should be a good way to talk to other people. So we hosted a forum at the beautiful domain scroll.at or scroll at, a little code joke that we had. It grew into Austria's biggest web design and web development forum.
Wow.
And
wow.
it was amazing. I got my first taste of community building. We had no idea that we should call it that back then. It's just a couple of people getting together, somebody posting a snippet of code, going like, hey, this doesn't make sense in this browser. The browser wars were fully in effect. And from that, it just, I guess, snowballed. I organized DevOps Days Amsterdam for 5 years. I've hosted countless meetups. It's been a lot of fun. It's been very rewarding. And I think becoming a developer advocate at HashiCorp was just the next step in that evolution. It just made sense when I saw the job ad. It's like, you know what? Talking to people, learning from them, what's the stuff you're working on? And, not just what's the stuff you're working on, but what's the stuff you're working on that you're struggling with? Give me that feedback and let me help you figure this out. Maybe you are missing, insights into a pattern that you could be using, or maybe it's legitimately a product concern that we don't support a certain feature. So it was really easy to think that this would make sense as a role. Been here for 3 years, met countless practitioners. Can't promise that I remember everyone, but I can promise you that all of them have been good experiences and useful, I think, for both of us.
That's awesome. Yeah, really cool. Just how you traced your origins from web development to DevOps days to now HashiCorp. Really, really great that you're out on the front lines and loving it all the while. That's really good to see. So coming to HashiCorp, I want to ask about just HashiCorp's positioning and its sort of reason for existence in a world where, there's the hyperscalers, and they have such a vast range of products and services that they offer as well. So it's a crowded world, and there's on the other end of the spectrum, there's these, small startups that keep cropping up every month in the space. So HashiCorp is right in the middle there. How would you say, how would you say is HashiCorp's positioning in this crowded cloud native space? What's unique about HashiCorp?
I want to say we're at the sweet spot. I'm thinking of this from an operator perspective as somebody who needs a tool that communicates with, like you said, the hyperscalers, but also the smaller startups. And I want something that just translates my needs, like I need virtual machines or I need a whole data center, to an API call that makes sense. And then, of course, let's be honest, virtual machine, great start. We're going to need some networking. We're going to need some DNS stuff. We're going to need monitoring, observability tooling. This is an endless list. We're going to exhaust an hour talking about just the buzzwords that we need to get stuff going. For us, I think that's also the reason Terraform is so widely used. If you go to our registry, you'll find we have, I think last I checked, 3,100 different providers. They serve any purpose from any of the big clouds, AWS, Google, Azure, of course, DigitalOcean. If you want to keep it in Europe, Scaleway, great choice. to down to the simplest things like how do I render a cloud init config, all in the same tool. And where that gets powerful, I think, is that because they're all rendered through the same tool, you basically have a lingua franca for infrastructure. I no longer need to remember that, oh, this API just takes JSON. Oh, this is a GraphQL API. This API requires some weird SOAP interactions that I've long forgotten and very glad about. Terraform just exposes a simple interface to me. It gives me a configuration language, and it makes it so that I can interact with whatever I need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess, the power of this is that you aren't boxed into any one type of infrastructure or location, and that there's more choice. Would you say that's true?
I think that's definitely true. Terraform enables you to have a multi-cloud strategy. Doesn't necessarily make it, one-click deployment, because that's not how it works, but it definitely makes it easier. And I think that's where it's important. Let's take some architecture best practices. Don't have your DNS host or your domain registration at the same company as your cloud computing. Because if your website or if your payment fails, your domain goes offline and you have zero control. Not a good site. So now you have provider one, let's say DNS simple, and you've got provider two, let's say AWS. How do you make sure when you go to mydomain.com that you actually get routed to the right place? Well, in this case, you can plug it together with the API, and that's what Terraform does.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Really neat. Yeah. And you see so many organizations, their cloud setups. You see, how many of them rely on just one cloud vendor, how many of them have multi-cloud setups. You see a lot about just what's happening out there. And I want to ask you, what do you see happening in terms of cloud infrastructure, and how organizations are changing and how they use the cloud? What are some of the trends that you notice these days?
So there's two things that I'm personally super excited about. We're finally stepping away. It feels like, I think we talked about this during KubeCon on another amazing recording. It feels like we're growing up in the current generation of tooling that we have access to. We're focusing more on security. We're focusing more on stability. And we're stepping away from forcing ourselves to do too much manual work. And the only reason that's possible is because the tooling has grown with us. 10 years ago, a lot of the stuff that we can do very easily right now wasn't as easily accessible. 15 years ago, we had different tools. They were great and they were better than the tools 30 years ago. But today, the comfort is just so much better.
Wow. Yeah, that's really good to hear. And I wanted to just dig in a bit in what we're talking about in terms of security, because you mentioned it even earlier, talking about HashiDays. Could you tell us a bit more about the challenges with security that organizations face today, how they're different, and how is HashiCorp solving for them, whether that's through the Terraform product itself or whether it's through your other products like Vault? Could you just give us some more context around this security conversation?
Of course. So if we look at a standard application, I like to use my WordPress site as an example. I'm going to have a couple of things. One, I need access to a cloud provider. Two, WordPress, being PHP and MySQL or Postgres driven, needs access to a database. So I'm going to need database credentials. And then likely, because obviously my site of baby pictures is very, very famous, I need a CDN in front of it. So maybe that's a third provider. Those credentials of having access to a database, having access to a CDN provider, a third party, they don't need to be long running, but they used to be. Because let's be honest, as engineers, we hate having to go in and replace a single string. Rotating is hard. rotating is cumbersome because one, you have to remember, oh, I put this string in this file, I put that string in that file. It requires application knowledge that you as the operator might not have or might not care to have. So our tools, Terraform in this case and Vault, make it easy to, or easier, let me put it this way, to in the first place, not have the hard-coded credential, but have dynamic credentials. Okay. Now on its own, having a dynamic credential is already pretty cool because instead of having something that I set up, May 25th, and that runs until May 25th next year, we actually have something that I set up on May 25th. And 15 minutes from now, it will expire. That is power. Where this gets more interesting is when you combine this with more systems. Your website doesn't necessarily need database access all the time. And when it needs database access, generally speaking, depending on the site setup you have, you might only need read access to get some data from the database. You might not need write access. So why not give our application just the credentials it needs for that very specific query? If you want to do that without automation, boy, it's better to hire at that point another 3 teams because it's impossible. With automation, a lot easier. You put in, your application puts in a request with Vault, obviously fully automated, and requests credentials that are read-only. We know that our website can read the database within 3 to 5 seconds. So let's set a timeout of 15 seconds. Very generous. With that time, within that time, you can read from the database. And after 15 seconds, Vault just goes in and revokes those credentials for you. Nothing to do on your application. Very important because you don't want to have to deal with that flow, and you shouldn't. And meanwhile, if somebody manages to exfiltrate those credentials, if it's past those 15 seconds, they don't have credentials. They have a piece of text that looks like a credential. So that's already the first good thing that's happening. The other good thing is because we're fully automating it, we're making it so much easier to be very specific. None of the cloud providers, if we're taking a step back, none of the cloud providers charge you for having IAM users, right? Entities or service accounts, service principals that can access their cloud. So why not have fully automated accounts that get spun up just when you need them, revoked right after you're done, either manually because you say, hey, you know what, I've got a token that's valid for 15 minutes, but I'm done after 3. I'm going to revoke it. And if you forget, Vault does it for you. Security is always hard. The only way to make security palatable is to make it easier and to automate it.
Wow, really cool. So how do you define the access controls in a workflow like that? Is the access given at the application level so that different application and services have access at different levels? Or is there another way of giving access? How is that managed?
So a couple different ways. My personal favorite is through job tokens. So say you're running a CI/CD pipeline. I'll use GitHub Actions because I'm a huge fan of not having to run my own CI/CD. So when my GitHub runner starts up, basically just a task runner, it pings my Vault instance, provides from it the repository, the runner ID, and a couple of other credentials, and then Vault issues a token. And that token is only valid for that one runner. So in all of GitHub's infrastructure, you need to have access to that runner. So you being able to breach my security system is already a lot harder because not only do you need to breach mine, you need to figure out a way to break into GitHub's infrastructure. Not saying any of this is impossible, but of course, defense in depth, we want to have as many layers as possible to make it as hard as possible. Then we attach a policy to it. Runner has ID 123, and we're scoping our credentials to that run. So if the runner doesn't identify with the correct runner ID, and obviously it's a little bit more complex than 123, then you already have credentials that are not worth anything. This, on the operator side, makes it easy to say, I can give you very specific access to what you need through a policy and not have to worry about what happens if it leaks, because at that point, it's likely expired, you have to be in a very, very privileged position to even get to the plain text credentials. And even then, you're actually not having access to the plain text credentials because you're going through JWT or JSON Web Tokens. And with an OpenID workflow, you're just never seeing those. So if you're looking at the whole attack surface and you think of it as a circle, we're talking the smallest pie slice ever. The kind of pie slice where it's like, did I actually get any pie? Or am I just staring at a whole pie here that nobody's even allowed to touch?
Wow, really nice. And following up on that, I want to ask about just policies that you spoke about, and you even mentioned earlier about Terraform having its own scripting language, if I'm using the right term. I want to ask about just how, in terms of defining all of these policies and the configuration, how much of a learning curve is involved for someone who is new to the HashiCorp universe? Do they need to learn new scripting languages, to work with these tools? Does it use something like a Rego to define policies? What are some of the design decisions you've taken to say, this is how much we expect users to learn about our system before they can start using it, versus this is how much they should already know this stuff and be able to use this as soon as they join? What are some of the design decisions you made?
Right. So for Terraform, we use a language called the HashiCorp configuration language. And the name already implies a little bit, we're not trying to have a programming language. We're not having a scripting language, though we have some functions in there. We have a configuration language. And the reason for that is really simple. Imagine you're running a large-scale infrastructure. At 3 a.m, when your pager goes off, do you want to be looking at how control loops work, how a for each is set up, and if that's set up correctly, or do you want to have simple words that tell you exactly what's happening? It's a question that everyone should answer for themselves. I'm category 2. I like things that are simple. So in order to work with Terraform, but also all of our other tools, you need to learn HCL. HCL, currently version 2. Initially, if you have been with us for a longer time, so think Terraform 0.11 up to that point, was HCL 1. More configuration language at that point and less functions, but still, if you learned it back then and you haven't used it for the past 5 years, you'll still know your way around. It's kind of like riding a bicycle. Now, here's what's cool. Most engineers I know that haven't had any Terraform experience, we've given workshops like this at events, at user groups. In 2 hours of a 4-hour workshop, most people have learned enough Terraform to be able to understand, hey, these are the lists, these are the strings, these are the variable types that we have, these are resources, these are data sources, basically the primitives the language gives you. And then it clicks, like, wait, so I can now define my infrastructure as text, as code? Yeah. And this is all there is to it? Yeah, it's the learning curve is much, much lower than with actual programming languages because we're not trying to be a programming language.
All right, got it. And is HCL also used to define policies?
Partially. So the cool thing about learning HCL is you learn it for Terraform, right? But you can also use it for Nomad, for Vault, for all of our other products. And that's where it's really powerful. You learned a single language that now works for everything. In terms of policies, yes, you can define Vault policies and other access policies for our tools with it. But if you want to define policies in the sense of OPA or Open Policy Agent, you'll want to be writing in Rego still. For the simple reason that Terraform Cloud, for example, integrates with OPA. It also integrates with Sentinel. For policy validation, the Terraform configuration language was not a good choice. And that's on purpose. Terraform tries to be a configuration language, and policy languages have a different makeup. I know there's community projects where people try to figure out ways to shoehorn HCL into it. We didn't design it with that approach in mind, and we're fine with people using Rego and Sentinel policies. Reason for that is simple. Use the best possible tool for the job.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And yeah, I think it's a great approach. And it's good to know also that, it just takes about 2 hours to really get familiar with HCL. And, that takes care of a lot of your infrastructure stuff. And policies, of course, I'm sure that, this approach does make sense, not just shoehorn HCL into managing policies. I think that really sounds good.
I think what I like about this is a lot of people had pre-existing OPA policies. A lot of people use Terraform with Kubernetes, and they wanted to validate things. Terraform didn't initially expose a way of doing that. Last year, we worked with our partner Stera. Then we onboarded OPA support into Terraform Cloud in an alternative way as well. So imagine you have a full policy library and you want to be using that. If your tool doesn't support it, there's 2 choices. One, you can rebuild your infrastructure in a tool that does. It's costly because all the bugs that you fixed, all the structures that you've set up, you now have to rebuild. More likely, and this is what we've seen with customers, is that they would step away from policy validation or figure out roundabout ways. And if there's one thing that I like about our tools is that they make things easier. They try to help you along the way. They don't try to get in your way. And when Terraform Cloud enabled OPA support next to Sentinel support, it's basically that one-click button where you can say, hey, you've got a policy library of 50,000 policies that you want to validate against your infrastructure. Cool, go right ahead. Let us know how it goes.
Really nice. And I want to talk about how you're just saying that, Terraform makes things easy. And more from a Kubernetes perspective, because, I've been seeing a lot of conversation about how Kubernetes, it's complex to manage. And, and which is why there's, of course, so many managed service providers for Kubernetes and all that. But I want to talk about just, from your perspective, using Terraform to manage Kubernetes, what difference does it make? How does it simplify your Kubernetes day-to-day management? Could you talk a bit about that?
Absolutely. So with a lot of managed Kubernetes solutions, and even with the unmanaged ones, you still have a couple of problems that you need to figure out. Let's talk managed first, because I think that's most applicable to people. You're going to deploy it in a network, a VPC or just a net construct. You need to set that up. You need to have access controls for that. You might want to have persistent storage that's not provided through Kubernetes. Totally possible. You might need load balancers that run outside the managed service. And even if they don't run outside the managed service, you'll still have things like your DNS zones and maybe even DNS subrecords. Then, of course, most of the cloud providers give you a way to tie in their IAM to Kubernetes. So their identity and access management. Just clicking deploy cluster is not going to help, because you still need to figure out, how am I going to manage my users? Imagine if you're a big company, all your users are in an Active Directory. How do you get all those users, or more realistically, how do you get the subset of those users that are in a very specific kube operators group synced in a way that's sustainable? And that's where Terraform helps.
All right, neat. Yeah, that sounds really cool. And I want to ask about also kind of jumping back to Vault a bit and just security. And you were talking about dynamic credentials, and that sounds really cool. But despite all this, there's the reality that once in a while secrets do get exposed, and people make mistakes, things happen. And in the case of an exposure, right, I want to ask about how does Vault handle a secret exposure? What kind of information can I get from Vault when there's an exposure, and how do I respond to it? How does Vault help with that?
So there's a couple of things that you can look at for that. Personally, I think the reactive stuff is very important, but the active stuff is even more important. Vault gives you access to dynamically rotated credentials, right? So instead of giving a dynamically rotated credential that's valid for an hour, figure out what your application's flow is and give it the shortest possible lifetime. It seems simple. It is almost like that, like BuzzFeed headline where it's like, oh, you won't believe this one sweet trick, but it is that one sweet trick. If you give out credentials that are essentially expired by the time somebody has broken in, you're good. So that's step one. Step two, have a system in place for what we like to call honey tokens. A couple of our partners think about this. These are credentials that if they leak, you'll know that honey tokens, or think of it like honeypots as a token that have leaked, you can specifically monitor for them. It's very hard to monitor for credentials that are unknown at the time of generation. It is not impossible to monitor for very specific tokens that you've preset in that same way. So we're solving part one by having policies that give you very, very limited and very restricted credentials that basically have zero lifetime or a couple of seconds. Step two, let's alert on things that we don't want to leak, but if they leak, we have notification system in place. Git Guardian, one of the companies that works on that, has pretty great tooling around that. If you're using GitHub and I think GitLab as well, both of these have security and scanning tooling now built in, even into the free accounts. And I think it's coming back to that shift that we were talking about. Security is hard, but if we make good security tooling available for free, we make it a lot easier. And that's the thing. Security is always a team sport. An application developer might not know, hey, these are credentials that I shouldn't leak. An application developer might not understand what the right policy is. A security professional will know, but they also might not know what to give an application. If we work together, we can figure it out. We can figure out the remediation strategies. And then, of course, purely from a monitoring and observability perspective, we can track the usage of certain secrets, and we can see, hey, this user here that used to have a usage pattern of usually 9 a.m., noon, and 3 p.m. is now requesting credentials all the time. So we have an outlier here. What's changed? Are people going to the application authentication flow more often? Is something else happening? So we expose enough to be able to build tools that monitor that, or what let's call it watchdogs. I think that's a good approach. So let's say, especially if you have a setup like Datadog, you could use Terraform to configure your vault to have an monitoring endpoint available. Going directly into Datadog, you configure your monitors in an appropriate way that when you see a secret have outliers in the usage pattern, that you can alert for that.
Really neat. And yeah, so I see that, there's a lot of proactive, there's a proactive approach to security that, that you advocate in, and that it's kind of, it's a lot of, security built into the design and just, not waiting for something to happen, but, just baking security in at different levels, at different steps. That seems to be the approach. And I think that makes sense. It's definitely better to be prepared and ready for something than to scramble later. So I think that makes sense.
Very much that. It's I think from an operator perspective, a lot of these features, if you're a very small company, might not be features that you care about, but they're available in the tool, and that's what's important. Your use case right now might be, I want dynamically rotated credentials. I want AWS credentials that Vault gives me that are valid for 5 minutes. I don't care about audit logging. I don't care about integrating other providers. I don't care about monitoring it. But as my application usage changes and my company grows, and maybe we build more applications, maybe we bring in different teams, Vault will still support you along that journey. And that's, I think, is what's crucial. You don't want to be 2 years into your company and having to change something very fundamental like the secrets management platform.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And I'm looking at your website right now, the HashiCorp website, and I see that, there's a bunch of different products that you offer across the range of cloud native. So, and of course, some of them, I've heard a lot more than the others. Terraform, obviously, your main product. Vault, you hear a lot about. Also heard a lot about Console and Nomad, but there's also many others there. Could you tell us a bit about, the suite of products and how your users use them? Which is the common entry point, or which are the few services that people get started with, and then how do they progress through your whole suite? Could you kind of give us some perspective on that front?
Absolutely. So there's a shift these days that a lot of people find Terraform to be their first entry point, or Vault. But with so many events taking place in person again, you have conversations and people go like, you're the people that make Vagrant, right? And I'm like, yes, that's us. I mean, we also have all these other products that you could be using, but yes, Vagrant is one of ours. And that's how a lot of people know HashiCorp initially. Vagrant was released, I want to say 2010, and it made it super simple to spin up a virtual machine on your own environment. The idea there being, we would deploy standard LAMP websites, so Linux, Apache, MySQL, and then PHP. Vagrant gave me a single file in which I could define what that machine should look like. Could say, store the database files in this directory, install these packages. And you could basically replicate your production environment through VirtualBox, through VMware, a couple of other options that we had back then. And it got people interested. As our usage patterns changed, we introduced tools like Terraform and Console. Vagrant still around, just got an update, I want to say last week. We're actively developing it, making it faster, making it more resilient, and rewriting it in Go for the simple reason that when we say you can use HCL across all of our products, Vagrant won't be the one that's left out.
Okay.
So that solves Terraform, Vagrant, and Vault. Packer is, I think, other than Terraform, probably my favorite tool because it gives you a shortcut to reliability.
Okay.
Packer builds machine images. And the reason that's important is, rather than have a rollout where you say, I'm starting up my virtual machine in a cloud provider, and then I'm going to install everything. I can shift that all the way to the left. I can do that in my pipeline way before we get to the point of deploying that machine. So let's say we're going to be recording a podcast. You want to have a Windows machine. You might not be on a Windows machine, but you want to have everything pre-installed. With Packer, you can define that in HCL. You can tell it to start up a machine in your favorite cloud provider, to install certain things, make certain settings, and have drivers enabled. Then Packer captures that information, that machine, and that artifact is now available through HCP Packer and also through your cloud provider to use in Terraform. So next time you're recording a podcast, you can just spin up a new machine that has everything pre-installed. I think personally, that is super sweet because we're shifting a lot of the configuration work to all the way to the left. By the time I'm spinning up that image, what I'm spinning up is something that I know is good because I've run it through tests. I don't have to wait for those tests to complete. And most importantly, if the test failed, then this image never made it into production. We're not doing it, in the last second. We're shifting to a pattern where basically the last mile configuration is the smallest parts, maybe an API key that you're splicing in at the last second because you want it to be short-lived. That's about it.
Is this, sorry, anyway, yeah, you can complete and then I'll ask my question, follow-up question, yeah.
Then, if we're talking workload orchestration, especially in edge cases, especially in industrial cases, Or in high-end cases, like Roblox is a pretty good example. Nomad has been a joy to work with. I say this as one of the developer advocates on that product, but it's also for me an orchestrator that can take your application, no matter if it's containerized or not, has a huge promise. And that promise is, I don't care if you're giving me a Java jar, if you're giving me a Windows executable, or if you have an actual container image, no matter if that's Podman or Docker or whatever you have, I will run it for you. And that's important. A lot of companies have pre-existing brownfield infrastructure. They have their workloads in a way that they can containerize it. We've all been there 5 years ago where people would start to containerize everything. Suddenly you're looking at a Docker image that's 17 gigs. That doesn't scale. It's fun to talk about, but it's definitely not good. And if we're forcing people to have to go into that pattern, then we're forcing them to make architecturally not super sound decisions. Of course, you can run it, but should you run it this way, or should you just run it in a natural way? And that's the use case that we want to solve with Nomad.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then there's Console, right?
Yes. So Console helps you figure out your networking story in not necessarily just a multi-region, but also a multi-cloud setup. So imagine you're the kind of company that does need to run in multiple clouds. I'm sorry, because that's hard. It's very hard because an AWS ELB does not talk to a global load balancer from Google in an easy way. So you have to figure out ways to do that. Console can help you with that. Also by having health checks built into that, by making it so that when your application goes to mydomain.com, when your user goes to your application at mydomain.com, instead of routing you to an unhealthy service, we're going to route you to a service that is actually responding. We can also help you figure out if there's any encryption that you need. Think MTLS, think, well, pretty much anything that you need to have in there that makes sense. Making sure your end user can reach your service in the most well-defined way is what's important for us. Of course, there's not just service discovery, but also service mesh. We have a very strong focus on being secure by default, which is hard because security is never easy. But by having mutual mutual authentication and encryption accessible to the user, we make that a little bit easier. And the user in this case was the operator. We're jumping a little bit through concepts here, but ultimately, I think that that works.
Yeah,
so,
and I think that there is a story that we kind of trace through all that you said, and I think one thread that keeps coming through it all is security, which you've mentioned multiple times, and you just mentioned as well in terms of console. And I was wondering if that's one of the big advantages of sort of using the whole suite of the HashiCorp products. Another unifying thread is that there's HCL itself, which works with all of them. What would you say, from your perspective? These are two things that come to my mind when I think of, why would you want to use more than one HashiCorp product, and you'd want to use them together? What are the advantages? These are two things that come to mind: HCL and security. Is there more that you would add, or is there more context that you can add even to these two things? Because these two itself are pretty big, I think.
Security and deployments are definitely huge parts. Even if all you use from our tooling is Terraform and Vault, you're already going to be having a better engineering experience than any team that doesn't. And they're huge. Of course, like you said, because we make the left side and the right side of that story, we have a better control. We have better integrations. When you're using Vault with Terraform and you need to have credentials for your provider, you can retrieve them. You can tell Terraform to contact Vault and give you provider credentials that are specific to that run. And the reason we can do that is because we know what those APIs look like. We know what we need to have happening on the left side, Terraform, and going into the right side, which is Vault, and then what Vault needs to give back so Terraform can actually use it. I think the power here is really that because we build so much of this story, we're creating solutions that work well standalone, very important, but we also build stuff that really can solve really, really big challenges in a straightforward way.
Awesome. So, for someone listening to this and excited to, start their journey with HashiCorp, how would you recommend they go about it? Would you recommend they start with their biggest pain point and figure out which of your solutions meets that pain point, start there? Or would you say, start with Terraform because, that's kind of like probably your most widely used or it's probably a great starting point. How would you recommend they get started?
So if people are new to infrastructure as code, I would definitely say start with Terraform because you're going to get that instant gratification. And we'll dive into that in a second. If you are a company that already has codified infrastructure through your cloud provider, think CloudFormation or ARM templates or something like that, then look at what you have in there and figure out ways to bring parts of that into Terraform. Because yes, you're still codifying your infrastructure, but you're now codifying your infrastructure with a tool that can talk not just that cloud, but all the other systems around it that you also need to have access to. Your monitoring tooling, your DNS and networking tooling, your CDN providers, maybe even your Jira system, if you want to manage it this way. As a team, super easy. You usually have multiple people. You can, figure this out. You can figure out the translation. But what if you're a single operator? How do you get that moment where it's like, all right, this is worth exploring? So one of the providers Terraform has is a Docker provider, which means I can now explain to Terraform in code that I want to have a specific Docker image running. I install Docker Desktop or the Docker CLI. Both of these work because both of these ultimately give you the same binaries, and tell Terraform, hey, you know what I want you to do is download this image from a registry, let's say Minecraft, because it's very rewarding. And then I want you to schedule that image locally or on a remote host. Could be anything in the cloud, could be just locally. Run Terraform plan, run Terraform apply, which are the two operations that you get to see what's happening and actually deploy it. And in about 30 seconds, depending on how long it takes you to download that image, you'll have Minecraft running inside Docker on your local machine. And this is where it gets fun. You just did that with, I'm going to say 15 lines of code. Not that impressive, right? Because we're just looking at a single thing. But what if I told you you can do this 100 times or 1,000 times in exactly the same way? And that's a promise of Terraform. We give you a tool that's reliable and consistently works the same way. And that's where it gets fun, I think.
Wow, really cool. So scale is where you really feel the difference and the advantage.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that's awesome. And I think with that, we draw to the end of our conversation, but I think it was quite fascinating. I think we started out with, this question of why HashiCorp in a world that's crowded. And I think we got so many answers to that question. And I think, I was expecting Terraform to really feature there, with infrastructure as code, declarative and all of that. That wasn't a surprise. But I think definitely the different points about security definitely were new, and they were very compelling because they came in across so many of the different points that you made. And I think that I was also able to see, the reason even for the design decisions behind HCL and then OPA, all of these different the ways of doing things with these products. And finally, we even ended with a bit of just how they work together and how you really feel the difference when you scale. So I think, we really got a very comprehensive answer to the original question that we had, which is why HashiCorp products. So thanks so much, Kerim. You really gave us a lot of context. You gave us a lot of, details to kind of chew into and even, research further if you want to do that. And I want to encourage all of our viewers to definitely do that because there is quite a universe of solutions that HashiCorp offers. And so definitely go and check out, all of these different products on their website. And definitely, if you're interested to know more, of all that Kerim spoke about, go and register for HashiDays coming up on
Definitely.
June the 13th. And yeah, I'm sure that the breakouts and the workshops and all of that are going to be a lot more hands-on and informative, and they're going to really be a great continuation of this conversation if you're really interested in this. So, Kerim, thanks again. That was really insightful and really engaging. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
And before you go, Kerim, just a couple of questions to get to know you a bit more. So I want to I ask all of my guests this and really, as a window into their lives. What would be your alternate career if not for your job in tech?
So this is an interesting one because, like when you work in tech long enough, eventually you get to think about that point. It's like, what am I going to do once I no longer feel like typing code and, building infrastructure diagrams? For me, I keep joking that I'll find a small town that I'll move to and start a bakery. I've had bakers in my family for about 3 generations now.
Man.
I like baking. I'll just, I'll go do that.
Awesome. Oh, man. That's cool. Do you have a signature thing that you bake?
Yeah, so I was born in Austria. Of course, Sachertorte is definitely something that I'm happy to whip up for guests when they come by. I've slightly adjusted it as I've gotten to the point in life where sometimes you need to have chocolate cakes and wine at the same time. So it's a red wine triple chocolate cake that has 3 sorts of chocolate in there, hence the triple chocolate. It's very rich, it's very indulgent, and it's very rewarding both during the baking process and afterwards.
Okay, my mouth is watering. I'm going to go get something from the bakery right after our call.
That's how awesome. I sell it to myself, where it's like, you know what? The hours are going to be different. Maybe it's not going to be as easy as IT is, but hey, you know what? It's going to be rewarding when people eat whatever you bake.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really cool. And your next question. So, as developer advocate, that's one of the roles where, you do a lot of things. You wear a lot of hats, developer, product guy, marketing guy, different things, designer, UX designer, different things that just come into it. Which of these roles would you say resonates with you most?
I think for me, it's still very much the developer part. In order to have good conversations with our practitioners, I need to understand our products. And the only way I can do that, I can't read a brief and go through a 2-page PDF and go like, oh yeah, now I understand this feature. I try to get my hands dirty every week with our tools to figure out, hey, are there good patterns that I could be teaching? Are there patterns that somebody showed me that maybe I should bring to more of the audience? Or also conversations like this, where somebody mentioned, oh, you know what, this was a really big problem for us in the company. You know what, I'll spend some time figuring out if I can figure this out for you. I'll share it back to you. I'll share it with other people, because the reality is, if you're running into that problem, there's guaranteed to be somebody else who's also running into that problem. So for me, definitely the developer part. Of course, like you mentioned, product focus and almost like product marketing and design, they're important, because when you present something, you have to think about a certain aesthetic. Not so much the corporate branding guidelines, but if I show you my code editor in the way I normally work in, you're going to be confused, because there's a myriad options in there that make my life easier, but you won't have any idea what to focus on the screen. So how do we tell a story that contains the actual story that I want to tell without taking away from it, without making you feel like you first need to have a crash course on my storytelling style. So you wear a lot of those hats, but those I wear least often. I think the actually using our tools is the one that we all of our people in our team, all the advocates, wear most often, and I'm glad for that.
All right, really cool. The next question, which is one software tool or product that you think is very well built, elegantly built?
I don't know if it's elegantly built in the sense that it's beautiful to look at, but obviously with theming, it's possible. I'm a huge fan of JetBrains IDEs. I use Golang personally. They're my Swiss Army knife. I can strip away the interface parts that I don't care about. I can have, several different terminals open that follow along with what I'm doing, especially in a Terraform and Vault workflow. You're going to be typing a policy. You're going to be typing a resource. You want to see how that resource performs. So all of that, very important. It is basically my control center for my code. So from that perspective, I think definitely Golang and all of the other JetBrains IDEs.
All right, cool. Your last question, Kerim. Where do you go to find out what's new and happening in tech?
So it used to be, like for many of us, Hacker News type sites. So for general IT, you've got Hacker News, but let's say you're in front-end development, you've got something like Echo.js. If you're into bioinformatics, there's different versions. These days, it's mostly newsletters that I come across that are run by individual people, not like a company newsletter. Which isn't to say that companies don't have interesting newsletters, but I'm more interested in those people that go out and find things. There's a couple of security ones that I really like reading because it almost seems like they spend that week figuring out, like, hey, this is some security tooling you should be looking at. And, every week you'll have a few things that you come across that are like, in 10 minutes, I can figure out, does this have value for me or does it not? And so, let's take the OpenSSF, the Open Source Security Foundation as an example. One of the security newsletters that I had mentioned a project called Security Scorecards. And what it does, it's a CLI tool that looks at your code repository on GitHub, GitLab, probably others, and it will tell you what your score is based on best practices. Compared to OWASP top 10 and getting a score. And my first thought is, like most developers, I've got everything locked down. How hard can it be? You get a score out of 0 to 10. I scored a 6.4. Once you stop, feeling hurt, you can start looking into fixing things. Then you realize, hey, you know what? We have too few people that have access to this repository, so we have a high bus factor. Hey, we don't actually pin our dependencies. We should be doing that. So things like that are really, really helpful for me because I have to be aware of what's happening, but I don't have the time to go out and find all of these tools myself. And those small newsletters make it much, much easier.
Really cool. That's the first time someone's mentioned this, actually. And how do you find them? Is this on something like a Substack or is it somewhere else?
Some are on Substack. Others are like somebody will tweet, oh, you know what? We're sponsoring this week's episode. It's like, okay, so I like you as a company. If you're sponsoring that newsletter, it's probably worth looking into for me. And there is no preset way to easily find them. I don't think there's a directory that I could just point people to. It really comes down to, find what you need.
Neat. All right. With that, we come to the end of all of our questions for you, Kerim. It was a really fun time chatting with you about all things HashiCorp and getting to know you a bit more as well. Have a great time at HashiDays, and we would love to have you more, to talk about maybe a follow-up once you've made all of the announcements and releases of the new features. We could probably do a follow-up for you to tell us, this is new and this is exciting with HashiCorp. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you so much for having me.